afternoon and welcome to our October Headliners Luncheon. I am so happy to have you all here. My name is Tara Poulton. I'm on Chamber staff. I serve as the Vice President of Public Policy and Workforce Partnerships. If you all could first silence your cell phones. Then if you could please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And also, I'd like to recognize our elected officials joining us today. If they could please stand and be recognized. We have Clerk and Comptroller Angel Colonesso. From Vern Buchanan's office, we have Sally Shelley. Chloe Conboy is also coming. I don't know if she is here yet. I don't see her. And we have a couple commissioners coming, but they have not yet arrived. So I will let you know when they do so. Thank you all so very much for your service and commitment to making our community such a wonderful place to live, work, and play. I do want to recognize our headliners sponsors today, Florida Power and Light, the Mosaic Company, and the Realtor Association of Sarasota and Manatee. I also want to thank our platinum sponsors. Those companies are now on the screen. Brown & Sons Funeral Homes and Crematory, Carr, Riggs & Ingram, IMG Academy, Manatee County Government, Manatee Memorial Hospital, MCR Health and All Care Options, the Mosaic Company, Pittsburgh Pirates and Bradenton Marauders Baseball, Raymond James Wealth Management, Bruce Spotty, Sarasota Bradenton International Airport, and South State Bank. Thank you all so very much for those of you that are here today. With less than 2 weeks until the midterm general election, voters in Manatee County are already casting their votes. I actually pulled a screenshot. I realize it's hard to read, but this was pulled from Vote Manatee just this morning. More than 41,000 here locally have already voted, mostly by mail. Early voting, as you all know, kicked off Monday, and so far, just over 5,000 have voted in person at one of our 5 designated locations throughout the county. So this is a live tracker, so definitely continue to keep your eyes on this. As you know, the Manatee Chamber is a nonpartisan organization and does not endorse candidates. We seek to add the voice of business to important issues and topics and share helpful information with our members. We also take positions, including positions on specific policy and ballot items. Since we are in the middle of vote by mail and early voting right now, we do have a local ballot item that we don't want you to miss. Now, at the end of this year's ballot, there is an item called the Economic Development Tax Referendum. If approved, it would continue a program that helps our community compete for corporate investment and higher wage jobs. The Economic Development Ad Valorem Tax Exemption, also known as the E-Date, is a temporary tax exemption set up by the Florida legislature. In 2013, Manatee County voters supported this ballot item, allowing the Manatee County Board of County Commissioners to establish and implement the program locally. And the Manatee Chamber supported passage of this item then, and we support its renewal now. This support is shared by other business organizations, including the Bradenton Area Economic Development Corporation and the Gulf Coast Builders Exchange. We believe that this is a necessary economic development tool that will help us remain competitive, and we encourage you to vote yes. Moving on to today's program, to help share insights on what to expect with this year's election cycle, we are so excited to have Dr. Susan MacManus joining us today. I actually was lucky enough, I was her student many years ago at USF when I got my undergrad. I certainly didn't realize then that I would one day have a career in public policy. And I don't think Dr. MacManus did either, because I don't remember doing very well in her class. It It was a tough class, and I definitely did not get an A. So with that, thank you for being here. We'll now allow Pier 22 to serve our lunch, and we'll be back at the podium in just a few minutes to formally introduce Dr. MacManus. Thank you. I now have the distinct honor of introducing Dr. Susan MacManus. I have to say, Casey Welch from USF was actually supposed to be doing the introductions this morning, and the poor guy, he is stuck in traffic. I don't know if anyone heard, but I-4 somehow was shut down today, so he is hoping to still make an appearance. Unfortunately, he's not here to do this, so I know my introduction probably will not be as great as Casey's would have been, but I will do my best. Dr. Susan MacManus is the leading expert on politics in Florida, nationally known for her expert and incisive commentary on public opinion and intergenerational politics. She is a University of South Florida Distinguished University Professor Emeritus, go Bulls, in the Department of Governmental and International Affairs within the School of Interglobal Studies. For several years, she served as the political analyst for WFLA, the Tampa's NBC affiliate, and since 2016, she's been the political analyst for ABC Action News, the ABC affiliate in Tampa. She has appeared on every major broadcast and cable television and radio network and has been interviewed by major newspapers in Florida, the United States, and abroad. She's also served as the chair of the Florida Elections Commission from 1999 to 2003. I think that's when I was your student. She helped the Collins Center of Public Policy draft Florida's Help Florida Vote Act state plan, which was required by Congress to qualify for federal funding under the Help America Vote Act. She's also served as an advisor to the Florida Division of Elections of the development of its statewide poll training manual. And if that's not enough, she has also authored and co-authored numerous political books throughout her career. Dr. MacManus received her bachelor's degree from Florida State University, her master's degree from the University of Michigan, and then returned to FSU for her PhD. She has held faculty positions throughout the country before joining USF in 1987. Dr. MacManus, thank you so very much. We'd love to have you join us at the mic.
She forgot to tell you I'm a cracker. I'm a daughter of a citrus raising family. And as a child, every summer, my mother would bring us down here to the museum. And so I always have a nice affinity for Manatee County. So thank you for inviting me here today. And I'm glad my USF colleagues can be here. It was a joy to teach for 30 years at USF, and I still have a couple of my former students that work for me on a lot of the stats that you're going to take a look at. But you want to hear about the election, and I would really advise you to get your chairs so that you can see the screen, because I'm a data-driven person. Most of you know that about me. But this is obviously an exciting election. And there are certain things about midterm elections that we know to be true. First of all, only two exceptions in recent American history. The party that holds the White House almost always loses seats in a midterm election. And the president's party, though, tends to lose fewer U.S. Senate seats than they do House seats. And importantly, all of these we'll take a look at. The number of seats that's lost really it's sort of a judgment on the sitting president, but particularly the popularity of the president, the status of the economy, and the direction of the country. So with that in mind, let's just take a look at what it looks like. And this is the challenge for a lot of Democratic candidates across the country. Right now, the president's approval ratings are, as we say in our business, underwater. They're far more negative than they are positive. And in terms of the direction of the country, which to me, as I'm going to come back to, this is to me the best question for this entire election is this one right here, because people are upset. You don't get those kind of numbers of dissatisfaction from just one party. This is coming from both. So people are dissatisfied, but for a lot of different reasons. And obviously, every poll right now, every single poll is showing the economy and inflation are the top of the list for what people are concerned about. And here again, you can see the numbers are very much underwater. These are the president's handling of the economy and inflation, and it's worse for inflation than the economy, but both of them are well over 60%. This is not a good look. This is another thing that just came out that sort of goes to the point I was making about the fact that people are very disgusted with what's happening for different reasons. This NBC poll, which was just released last week, shows that we are having record-level interest. We're expecting record-level turnout in Florida for a midterm. Last 2018 was also record-level turnout in our state for a midterm. But we're also seeing tremendous polarization. And I was mentioning to some of my colleagues, I was at the gubernatorial debate the other night, and if there was ever a better visualization of the polarization of Florida, right in front of the theater was held on one side of the street were the DeSantis people, and on the other side were 100 women for choice in their pink shirts, and they're all shouting at each other. And I remarked to my colleagues, I said, is this the best visual of polarization of Florida that you've ever seen? Gratefully, and a tribute to our state, there was no violence, and I think we have a lot to say of that. One of the big controversies this year is over the women's vote, and women, as I'll show you, are a majority of the registrants in Florida, though not a lot. But there's some who say, forget the three things I told you are typical of midterm elections. Focus just on this, because Democrats have argued from the beginning of the Kansas the Kansas vote on abortion, that changed and tossed the midterm truisms right out the window. So beginning with the Kansas vote on abortion, Democratic attention started focusing on that as an issue for their candidates to run on. But what also happened, and you saw in Florida, but beginning in Virginia, but certainly in Florida, we've seen the rise of school mothers who are more concerned about education. We saw it with record turnout and interest in our school board elections of late. So you have these sort of counter arguments about the women's vote in Florida, Democrats running heavily on abortion, Republicans running more heavily on the education issue, both of them aimed at that all-important women's vote in our state. This just came out a couple days ago, a Gallup. This is the worst we've seen in a long time. People worried that their children are not going to have the same opportunities that they had. And this is, of course, if you're a parent, I am of the firm agreement that the whole election in Florida hinges on suburban parents. And this is one more indicator of the concern there. But what's important for you to know as very interested people, and I really appreciate most people by this point have tuned out of politics, so I'm very honored that you decided to come today. But what is really very important is you see how fast our state is changing in its demographic makeup. And we're starting with the party registration. It was in October of 2021 that for the first time in Florida history, the number of registered Republicans outnumbered the number of Democrats, though very small amount. The key for you and I, and this is a real challenge for both parties going forward, is that sharp line on the bottle, that purple line that's going up, 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 which is people who are registering as no party affiliation. And we'll have a little bit of a look at that later. But this is a sea change in our politics. This came out this morning. If you haven't seen it, I have already done a couple of interviews about this. This is actual party registration numbers, the book closing. In other words, this is people who are eligible to vote in this election. And it wasn't that long ago, 2 years ago, that Democrats had a really outnumbered Republican registrants in our state. But look what happens in 2 years' time. You see a really big change. And again, this is the product of a lot of different things, some of which is the pandemic brought a lot of people moving into Florida, leaving very blue states, moving here because of lockdowns elsewhere and all kinds of other problems. People who have moved to Florida, we now know are leaning more Republican, so some of those gains are people that have moved in here in recent years. But what people also need to pay attention to is the fact that we have the most diverse state in the entire country, both in our Hispanic populations and in our black populations. But what you do see here is, over time, the share that black registrants make up has been fairly steady, around 13%. But what you see, the big story, and that's why you hear so much this election cycle about the Latino vote, because it is now on a straight path upward. And if you saw the Washington Post article a few weeks ago, the article basically said to the country, don't use Florida, Democrats don't use Florida as a way to reach Latinos, because Democrats in Florida are not doing a very good job of doing it. And a lot of it, you and I know this, it's because the Latino vote is extremely diverse in terms of countries of origin, which matter a lot culturally and politically within those communities. So that is really made it difficult, but the socialism issue is what has bound together Colombians, Nicaraguans, Cubans, Hondurans, Venezuelans into a more solid voting bloc among Latinos, whereas we're voting Republican, whereas Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans tend to lean a little bit more Democratic. But Annette Tadeo, when she was running for governor, pointed this out, is that she was chiding her fellow Democrats, look, you're not really approaching this population like we need to. And so I think after the election is over, depending on the outcome, probably go back to the drawing boards there. Overall, of course, blacks are heavily Democratic, whites, plurality Republican, but Asians, Hispanics, and others, the plurality or no party affiliation. So there again is a challenge to the parties as to how do you reach these groups that are growing in stature, because by 2040, Florida will be a non-white majority state. And so these groups are growing fast. This is one thing that people outside of Florida still don't get. They still think everybody here is 95 or older. And this is really critical, you know, because as old people get older, some of them pass on, you know. And so if you don't pay attention to generational replacement, you can be making some huge mistakes here. So just looking at the three youngest generations, you see that in 2015, they were 48% of Florida's registrants, but now they're 57%. This is what is critical. Democrats in Florida cannot win without grabbing a substantial share of these younger registrants. And it's really hard in a midterm where historically younger people don't turn out at the same rate as do older people. But ignoring this generational replacement, you can really make some very big mistakes in figuring out how to reach and campaign effectively to voters. In terms of this, if you add together, it's kind of hard to see here, but let's suffice it to say that Generation Z and the millennials are now 33%, and boomers are only 32% of Florida's current registrants. This is actual current data. And that's, again, shows the nature of the change in our age makeup. This is the challenge. The younger you are, the more likely you are to register as no party affiliation. We see younger people turning their backs on both parties. And for those of you who really study generational patterns and so forth, if you think about it, the two youngest generations have been really matured politically, meaning turning 18, during very stressful periods. They've had tough lives so far, and they don't see either party as really doing much for them, because a lot of them, to them, politics, if you say politics, they, like so many other people, say that's Washington. They don't think about state and local so much in politics, because so much of our curriculum, I'm going to give a little PR here, in higher ed just focuses on national politics as opposed to requiring that people learn something about state and local politics. I think that needs to change, but then again, I was a professor of state and local politics, so of course. It's also very true that the younger generation is already, think about the changing racial and ethnic demographics of Florida. The youngest generation, these are actual registrants, already a majority non-white. and the millennials very close to it. And in fact, there again, if you take the three youngest generations, you see that over half are, close to the younger ones, already a majority Black or Hispanic or Asian. Women, of course, for years elsewhere here as well, make up a majority of the registered voters of our state, but there's some really interesting things here. Women lean more Democrat, Republicans, males, a plurality are males. And then we have a category in our state called unreported, and a lot of that reflects younger people who don't like to use binary definitions of gender. We're starting to see that issue kind of bubbling up. But you see, it's not surprising, knowing that they're largely young, that the plurality there are NPAs. Women are clearly a much larger share of Democrats than men. It's closer to parity among Republicans and NPAs. But you begin to get an appreciation for Democratic women's strength in this state and to why some of the push towards abortion has been very, very strong among older women in particular who fought the fight on that issue. The gender gap, though, significantly is bigger among women of color and men of color. It's really made a difference. Do you realize, you probably wouldn't, but 49% of all women candidates who ran for either the state legislature or Congress or one of the state executive offices, 49% in Florida were women of color. And why is this? And I speak to my colleagues at the education table here. It's because women of color are going to college and men are not. And you really see the impact of education on the activism of the differential between men and women. It's also true, looking ahead to the abortion theme, about that being the driving force that would make abortion, make the midterm a different than usual pattern. It doesn't bear out in our state. If you look at the 2020 election, there was only 3% difference in how women of Florida voted in the presidential race. By the way, that was the closest of all 50 states. And you see it more in presidential than you do in midterms, and of course, that's what, but Gillum was able to bring out a lot more younger women and younger voters than it looks like that Chris will be able to do. We don't know yet. It's still out for grabs to take a look at that. So really, everybody's looking at Florida, and there's a good reason why on all three counts. First of all, the U.S. Senate, it's tied right now. Both parties are just really wanting, the Democrats really desperately want to flip this seat Democrat, and Republicans are holding on for dear life, because we are one of the keys that's a calculus to who controls the U.S. Senate at the end of the election. And in Congress, you see here that all that has to happen is a 5 net gain in the House for Democrats for them to win back control of the House. And because of redistricting, most of you know, very controversial in our state and probably going to be under litigation as soon as the election's over, and still is actually in litigation right now. We now have more Republican districts as a consequence of the redistricting. So we could easily supply the four seats right here. And of course, the governor, if I've had one inquiry, I've had 1 million from people outside the state about DeSantis running for president and the Trump-DeSantis relationship. But the bottom line here is that Democrats really want to take DeSantis out because they do fear he's going to be a very strong candidate for the Republicans for president. They'd like to take him out now. On the other hand, Republicans would like to have a presidential candidate from our state, and so you see that kind of real focus on the governor's race. Now, in case you haven't seen any TV ads, I don't think there's anyone in here that can say that. Because we've already spent $66 million on TV ads in our state, and we're not even at the top of the heap. Look at these poor folks in Georgia and Pennsylvania. So what about our Senate race? It's a key one. These are real clear politics. This is sort of what everybody looks at. What they do is they take recent polls and they average them and they come up with a spread. It is true, if you looked at every poll that's been taken on this race, Demings has only been ahead in one poll, and that was considered an outlier. So I have said from the beginning and still believe this race will be closer than the governor's race. And but right now, Rubio's got anywhere from a 5 to 7 spread. But these are polls. I'm going to end up with polls because you can live and die by polls too. And it is true that one of the problems that Demings has had is because Florida's Senate seat has never been seen by big money, big Democratic money, as competitive as in other states. So they have not put, this is how much money comes into this Senate race from Democrats, from the candidates themselves, and then from outside groups supporting candidates. Notice Demings has no money from outside Florida Democrats. They haven't given her much, even though she's raised a lot more money, tremendously, a lot more money than Rubio. In fact, there was a time when Rubio actually sent out a fundraising letter saying, I need money, which to a lot of Republicans was unbelievable. But you see there that, again, that Rubio's gotten a different share. He's gotten support from outside Republican groups, which is more recent. But that, again, gives you an idea as to why Demings isn't doing better, because on paper, everyone thought she would be a terrific candidate, and it still may be very close. But, you know, when Florida's not as important in this race as other states like Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Georgia are considered must-have states for Democrats, they putting money there instead of here in the Senate. Now, we only have 2 races in our state for Congress that are considered competitive. Well, think about that. We have 28 congressional seats, and only 2 are considered really hot races. And of those, number 1 is the Tadeo-Salazar race in Miami. And, of course, we do have the other ones are right here in our area. No surprise, the I-4 corridor still wields a lot of power politically. But you see the Cone-Lee race, and in Pinellas County, the Lind-Luna race are considered the most competitive House races. In terms of the governor's race, this, if you believe in polls exclusively, is a runaway for the governor right now. The most recent polls, 2 of them in a row, have had him up by 11. Another poll came out this morning which shows 14. It's a poll I don't have a lot of confidence in, so I would rather stick with these kinds of margins. And let me just say a bit, even in the debate the other night, what happens is incumbency is powerful. Everybody hears that all the time. But think about it. In a debate, for example, the governor was able to cite 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, every question that came up, what he did, what he done, what he done. A challenger has less ability to do that. And the storm, which of course is first and foremost on a lot of people's mind, including around here, we see polls that show that over 2/3 or close to 2/3 of Floridians think the governor did a good job on that. So these kinds of things matter, but there is a natural incumbent benefit because people, and particularly think, how many people lived in Florida when Chris was governor? If you think back, it's a little bit, not as much. But nonetheless, it's still Chris is done well in the debate. He was forceful. He contrasted himself well. We clearly have a choice in Florida as to which candidate you want to vote for. It's also interesting, in light of the growing Latino presence in our state, that both of these gubernatorial candidates have Lieutenant Governor Latinas running as their running mate. I think that's quite significant. And ad spending on the governor's race, think of the red bar. DeSantis just outspent Chris. it's hard to win a statewide race in Florida if you don't have fairly equal funding. This is an expensive state to run in. In 2020, keeping an ad up for 1 week in all 10 media markets was $3 million. And this is why Chris had to spend a lot on the primary and then had to go back and start to replenish money again. That's a very, very difficult thing. And you can understand a lot of the polls, how this happens with money. The cabinet races are ho-hum. It's kind of interesting here, but the Miami Herald, way back a month or so ago, pretty much wrote these cabinet races off as being very competitive. And the only poll we had lately on these races shows that the Republican candidates, again, incumbency, name recognition, and even candidate Bloomer running for Commissioner of Agriculture really publicly attacked Florida Democrats for not helping her at all financially. And so the parties, have obviously not, the Democrats have not put as much money into their candidates. The closest one is the CFO, the chief financial. In terms of the legislature, we have all 160 up this year. All the senators have to run and all the House. And by everybody's accounting, Democrats aren't going to take control of either chamber in our state. A lot of that has to do with redistricting. But the place where you might see some pickup, a few seats in the Senate, might become a little bit more Democratic leaning, a couple in the House maybe. But of 40 Senate seats, only 5 are considered competitive. And you can see that the most competitive one is actually right here. The Janet Cruz, Jay Collins race is considered the #1 competitive Florida Senate race in the state. But also, if you're looking at it, notice a lot of these candidates in these competitive races are women. And that's kind of interesting. Those 2 in Miami, particularly, District 36 and 38, 4 women, in those races. And of course, that's what we have there. And in the House, we only have 4 races that are considered competitive. So this is what reflects. And more people, just so you understand, more and more people are choosing to move to like-minded communities politically. Do you know the Villages? Do I need to say more? There are other places just like that where people are choosing to want to live next, and that makes it harder when you're redistricting to draw a competitive district. But it's very frustrating to people who think that competition is the essence of democracy. And I think this is not a good trend that we're seeing where you have so few competitive seats. Many people don't even know that we're going to vote on Supreme Court justices. 5 of the 7 Florida Supreme Court justices are up for retention vote. You vote yes or no to give them a full term. There's a really strong underground, it's not getting a lot of attention, group that is very much against the conservative direction of the Florida Supreme Court, and they're publicly urging there's people who feel of that nature to only vote yes on one. Jorge Labarga is considered the more moderate or liberal of the justices, but you'll see they were all appointed by Republican governors at the time. So what are the big issues here? I don't really need to tell you. These are issues that were identified in September in our state, and nothing should be surprising, particularly here. What is interesting is that if you listen to the ads, each party says, vote for my candidate because we're the ones that represent freedom. And that's very interesting. And in terms of election integrity, which is disturbing to a lot of people, that we're not talking more about how to protect the integrity of our votes. From the Democratic side, they see voter suppression as the epitome of lack of integrity in our election system, but on the Republican side, it's voter fraud. So different looks, but both agreeing there's concern about the integrity of our elections. Everything else there is pretty self-explanatory. I do call attention to the top there, the abortion issue, tops among Democrats and the economy tops among Republicans. Now, this just came out last week. This was considered an earthquake in national politics. The New York Times Siena poll came out and basically said they saw the shift. The summer Democrats were regarded as having the edge, but the New York Times and their polling said all of a sudden it shifted again, and they identified the reasons, and they say that the public now is more focused on issues that are Republican-friendly than Democratic-friendly. And so this is, again, you can't see this too well, but the blue issues are ones where the Democrats have the edge over Republicans in the polling, asking them what's the most important or very important issue. And the red are the ones that the Republicans have the edge on. But immigration and health care and abortion are the three issues there's the widest divide on. And I, to this day, am wondering why Democrats have not focused more on health care, because it showed up in a lot of polls as extremely important, but it really hasn't been a big part of their campaign. So what is not important was equally laid out, and all this talk about the January 6th commission and anti-Trump and all of that, you can see, 29 to 30%. That's all that say these are really important to somebody and how they're going to vote. But what people are frustrated, and this is my number 2 big theme of this election, people in this country are over being told what the problems are. They know it firsthand, but what they want in candidates is how are you going to fix it? It's not enough to say we've got this problem and point fingers. And this is particularly a huge problem with young voters. When you look at news analyses, they say they don't like the news because all they ever talk about is the negatives and never about the solutions. This is, I think, something that we will see continuing to be an issue forward. And right now, enthusiasm for voting has switched. In the summer, it was heavily Democrat. Now it's more heavily Republican. So what about turnout? You see that Florida's turnout in the midterm of 2018 went up. Unfortunately, the turnout in our primary actually went down this time. And it went down more for Democrats than Republicans, even though Florida Democrats had a competitive governor's race for in the primary. I think it'll be high. There's just so much interest in it. I don't know that it'll break records, but I wouldn't be surprised. Just to give you a feel for turnout patterns over time, historically in both 2018 and 2020, the Republican turnout has been higher than Democrats. This in 2020, the first time ever in Florida history, Hispanic turnout was larger than black turnout, just by a slight bit, but that's significant. And by the way, Florida Democrats are very aware that they have got to ramp up black turnout. That's why you see Obama. That's why you've seen the president and other black leaders going down to South Florida, Broward County, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, very large black populations, trying to ramp that up. And we'll see how successful they are, but it is important that they get the turnout up. And then, of course, 2018, the millennial vote the midterm was lower than it is in a presidential, but that's true every election cycle. So, and of course, women turn out at a slightly higher rate than men, even though there's not a whole lot of difference there, but women have the edge. So, what is it going to be in 2022? Is it going to be another typical midterm election where you have, the president's party losing and more focus on the president's performance in office and the enthusiasm gap favoring the out party? Or is it going to be an atypical midterm election where the U.S. Supreme Court ruling will cut the Republican edge and the president's favorability ratings would still be higher than Trump? And have you noticed there's not much talk about Trump in Florida? Another intriguing part of this election. and that voters will weigh legislation passed by the Democratic Congress more heavily than the economy. Let me say something about younger voters that I've had communications with, younger Democratic voters, some of my former students. They tell me that their interest in this election cycle only began with the passage of the Inflation Recovery Act. Now, they don't know what that is, but what they do know is two components of it are top of their list for priorities: climate change and student loan forgiveness. Okay. So what is it going to be? I think if the election were held today, it would probably be the typical midterm. But then again, why predict Florida? We still have some really big questions up here about the younger vote turnout. Will it go up a bit like it did in 2018? Have Democrats solved the Latino problem and improve black turnout rate? Very big question, will suburban women who voted for Trump switch to Demings and Christ over the abortion issue? And then last, how big is the split going to be between women driven to vote by abortion and those driven by the economy and education? And I add one more thing, and I had a great conversation with a reporter from from Fort Myers. There's still a huge projected loss of Republican vote in that hard-hit Lee County area. And DeSantis did really well in 2018. And remember, that was a half of a point race that went to a recount. So we still don't know about that either. Now, polls are not fallible. They rarely predict turnout accurately. And the last one particularly, they can't catch last-minute vote swings, even though I think we're going to see less of that last-minute decision-making this year because the choices have been very clear. So if you believe that polls are infallible, you probably think that it would be a Republican year. But if you say polls are not worth the paper they're put on, well then, who knows? Thank you very much.
I just want you all to direct. Everybody look back. Now Casey Welch is now here. I'd like to bring Casey to the mic to help facilitate Q&A.
I thought he was going to say who wins.
Casey Welch is the Assistant Vice President for External Affairs and Government Relations at the University of South Florida, Sarasota Manatee campus. He is also the current chair of the Chamber's Legislative Committee. So I am so glad to see you here.
Me too. I'm glad to be here too.
How long did it take you to get?
Pro tip: if you're driving from Disney to downtown Bradenton, 4 hours. So go team. There's a little bit of construction and traffic that was shut down both directions. So I was in park. I did call Dr. MacManus and let her know and Tara know. So thank you all for it. But I won't take too much of your time. How about some questions for Dr. MacManus? Oh, yes. Yes, sir. State your question. And then.
Hi. I'm just wondering, in the time that you've been studying this, do you see, I guess, an evolution, a change that things have become principle, that maybe there was policy difference 40, 50 years ago in our politics, but now it's become, there's things that are almost, if you believe it one way or the other, it's not compromisable. And it's, how's that affected things?
It's terrible right now. And another issue, I couldn't cover two other issues I'd wanted to, but trust in government and all institutions in this country has plummeted, including the news media. And both parties and the news media itself and election activists very worried about the massive misinformation that's being spread through these social media networks, and even people today, and a great question, because people today are like silos. They only look at a certain media and it can be very different from the next person. Gone are the days, and I'm showing my age here, where you only had a few broadcast networks and they all covered the same thing and everybody got the same message. People now are selecting the sources of information on politics that they pay attention to on a very narrow basis, and there's no ever convincing them that the other side might have a point. It's so disturbing. And I have to say, I do believe that our press has emphasized conflict to the point of where the word compromise has gotten out of our vocabulary, and it's very, very disconcerting. But a lot of it has to do with the multiplicity now of informational sources that people have. And, even the fact checkers have become politicized. What started out really great, now if a certain paper has a fact checker, well, that's a liberal paper or that's a conservative paper. It's a mess, and I don't know how we solve it. And one other stat that I didn't put up here, 67% of Democrats and 67% of Republicans, the only thing I've seen this whole election cycle that they all agree on is that our democracy's in trouble. It's very sad and very challenging, but that's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. MacManus. That was a great presentation. My name is Bill Woodson. I'm at New College of Florida, and that first question was actually a perfect lead into my second. I do have two.
Okay. Two-parter.
I'll try to make it quick. So first, that misinformation dynamic. Are there a couple or three issues that you would identify that if people had a better understanding of the truth as opposed to the misinformation would change people's perspectives as far as how to vote or how to think about these things?
Number one, economics. Do you realize that when they do these surveys of educational knowledge and whatever, that people's knowledge of economics in this country is at second grade level? A huge portion can't even in a multiple choice test identify what is a profit or any other kind of term that they use. That would be number one. And secondly would surely be, there are three, education and healthcare, all of those. Education, healthcare, and the economy.
Thank you. And my second question, I think with regards to the abortion question and the new recent legislation, there's an assumption that if more women vote, then there'll be more voting for choice. I was just wondering if it's your perception that in Florida, that more women engaging in voting, better women turnout, would automatically mean, more people voting pro-choice versus pro-choice candidates versus pro.
I wouldn't assume that last, that it's going to be more, but I would assume that you probably have a much narrower gap in women voting on that issue. I would still say that probably more, it has to do with party changers. But I go back to that one where it showed just a 3% difference in party affiliation and how women vote. I think that you'll still see more women voters on the pro-choice side. The question is it going to be a large enough shift in that direction to mean that fewer women are going to vote on the basis of education and their kids? I still think the dominance will be more in the pro-choice, but not to the degree that supporters of that issue had hoped for and anticipated.
Last question.
My name is Keith Green, and as I was listening to some of the stats between whites and African Americans who usually vote Republican, and as someone who is a registered Republican myself, proud Republican by the way, what would you say contributes to those stats of lack of African Americans that are engaged in the Republican Party?
I think we're seeing a slight shift in that, and a lot of it has to do with historical trends and conversations within families, that it's been passed from one generation to another. And of course, some of the institutions, such as black churches for years, have been harbors for civil rights discussions and so forth, that have pushed that kind of message from one generation to the next.
And then my last and final question, of course, what can I, as an African American, do to get more African Americans engaged in the Republican Party per se?
Again, I think it has to do with interactions with various kinds of groups and explaining to particular younger generations which are more open. That NPA group is open to discussion. You see how big it's growing in this state. I would definitely start there. Now, there's one issue, and you reminded me of it. Thank you so much. You didn't realize you did. The biggest issue that's pushing a lot of, and it has to do with black voters, to vote, they're projecting to vote slightly more Republican this time. It's a massive issue, not in our state as much as elsewhere, is crime. Crime is now in national surveys. In many of the ones that are done by Gallup and others, it's now to number 3 as an issue. And a lot of that is crime in minority communities. We've had, the examples would be a lot of just drive-by shootings where innocent little children are murdered, but somebody just, and there's been, in some of the big cities, I wouldn't say massively, but black mothers kind of banding together and saying we can't have this going on anymore. We've got to have more enforcement of the laws and so forth. So it's slowly changing a little bit, but it's still the most cohesively Democratic voting bloc in our state. But thank you. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. MacManus, and I just want to say thank you to the Manatee Chamber for allowing a distinguished USF professor as Dr. MacManus, and I want to also recognize her again for her outstanding job on Monday night, being one of the questioners for the gubernatorial debate. I want to give you a round of applause for that. If you didn't already, fantastic job. And then I'll pass it to Tara to make a few announcements, so thank you.
Thank you, Casey. So glad you were able to make it safely. Dr. MacManus, thank you again. We love having you here. We look forward to having you here in the future. Special thanks to our sponsors today, the Mosaic Company, FP&L, and the Realtors Association. You all please have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next month.